Good morning, distinguished panelists and distinguished guests. First, thanks to Eric for inviting me to this launch of this very important initiative, the Global Policy Lab. We meet here in an environment where the world is really looking for new solutions, whether it is the dissatisfied, discontented in the industrial world who are not convinced that globalization is a good thing, or whether it's the dissatisfied and discontented in the emerging world who have seen this pace of progress slow. Given this, there is a need to rethink our frameworks, keeping what is good. Of course, there's tremendous aspects of good in our current frameworks. They what are responsible for the growth and development of many countries around the world, but also trying to understand what doesn't work and what is unfair across the world. And this is why something like the Global Policy Lab will be extremely important. I think anybody who goes to these international meetings, whether it's the G20, the IMF, the World Bank meetings, comes away immediately with a sense of asymmetry. That is, the industrial countries are often well prepared, have a fair number of economists who will cite research, and the agenda is often set by the industrial countries. And as a result, the emerging markets are often in the position of reacting. And they know what they like, they know what they don't like, but they have very little basis to offer rationale. And so it essentially boils down often to the industrial countries setting both the agenda as well as final outcomes, with a few modifications based on how strongly the emerging markets feel about issues. Now, being reactive rather than constructive is a bad position to be in. And I think it is far more important for the emerging markets to provide alternatives to even start setting the agenda for a certain set of issues. And I hope that initiatives like this one and the collaborations across the world will help the emerging markets start playing a role which is commensurate with their growing economic position in the world. It's not so much, certainly there is a need to take a look at the governance of international institutions, changing both structures and so on as part of the medium-term agenda. But even today, I think there's a fair amount of openness in these bodies which can be exploited by the emerging markets to put forward their viewpoints. But to do that, they really need a lot more engagement, but also a lot more background research, and that's where I think this lab can play an important role. What I want to do today is talk about an issue where I think we need more research, where I think we need to move away from accepting the status quo, and that's on the rules of the game concerning monetary policy. And let me start by saying that this is an area, monetary policy across the world, where we used to have one rule. And that rule was no central bank will engage in sustained unilateral intervention in the exchange rate. And the idea was to prevent countries from getting a competitive advantage by depreciating the exchange rate, something which was thought to be a problem during the pre-Depression years and through the Depression, which is why we had the Bretton Woods Agreement. And so one way, once we went past the Bretton Woods Agreement, to replicate this was to have a rule. And I would argue that even this one rule has been thrown out of the window. We have had countries, central banks in industrial countries, that have engaged in unilateral intervention in protecting their exchange rate. Now, that's not the, is that in here or outside? Okay. Okay, that's the prelude to the what follows, right? So the question then is, do we need any such rules? And I would argue that with the advent of very low interest rates, very low inflation, central banks have gotten ever more creative in the kind of interventions they undertake in markets. And some of these interventions, especially if interest-sensitive segments of the economy are pretty much overladen with debt, effectively have their primary effect through the exchange rate. And the question is, yeah, we sort of frown on sustained unilateral intervention in the exchange rate. We've thrown that out, pretty much out of the window. But are there other ways we also continue doing that? And is this potentially a source of worry going forward? Now, I'm going to elaborate on this in a second. But of course, as a former central banker, having just left the club of central bankers, which is a pretty close-knit club, given that central bankers can't really talk to anybody else, there is a question that my former colleagues could well ask, now that you've left the club, why are you raising these issues, right? Because central bankers are already under attack across the world. They are a convenient target for the populist nationalist, because after all, central bankers are the quintessential elite, right? Many of them have PhDs. They talk a language nobody else understands. They meet in far-off places in closed rooms with smoke coming out. So it's really, they are a shadowy cabal. And the question is there a danger of raising these questions about international rules at a time of extreme populism? Could this sort of subvert the overall mission of central banks? And I recognize that danger. That is a very important danger. At the same time, if you don't have any rules, there is equally a danger of the populist nationalists saying, thus and such central bankers trying to depreciate the exchange rate through this exotic instrument that they call, let's say, QQQQE. And that's a bad thing, and therefore we're going to impose trade sanctions because they're manipulating the exchange rate. The point is we need some sort of framework which allows people to say, yes, they're all in consonance with the broader framework. Again, relatively light, but at least clear enough so that we're not defeating the rules of the game. So with that as background, let me quickly walk through why I think we have this problem today and we didn't have it maybe 10 years ago. Clearly, what has happened across the world is two things. One, many of us moved towards inflation targeting regimes with both an upper bound and a lower bound. Historically, the upper bound was what was significant. We sort of knew that it was important to bring inflation under control within a certain level. And what was difficult was really doing that. We never imagined that too low inflation would be a problem. So the lower bound was set, but it wasn't thought of as that critical. It was the upper bound that we were fighting in the mid-80s, early 90s, late 80s, early 90s, when many countries moved to these regimes. More recently, the problem has been the lower bound, with low inflation, low real interest rates, aging populations. Put all those together, mix them up. The point is, the lower bound has become more significant. And unfortunately, we really don't have as good a sense of how to bring inflation up as we have of how to bring inflation down. And we've tried many instruments in a number of countries, always defeated by the private sector essentially undoing some of those instruments. So in fact, you pump the money supply up, well, people are willing to hold infinite quantities of money without question. The problem is central bankers can't admit defeat because of fear that if they say, throw up their hands and say, I've done everything I can thus far and no more, there's a worry that this may reflect a lack of commitment, may signal a lack of commitment, and the market earlier had expectations you would achieve the 2% target. Now that you throw up your hands and say, I've run out of instruments, the inflationary expectations collapse and it becomes -1, -2, and then the fear of central bankers that you get spiraling deflation starts taking hold. Now, this hasn't happened, but this is certainly a potential fear. So given that you don't want to throw up your hands and give up and say, I can't do any more, you always have to pretend you have something else behind your back. So you never hear a central banker saying, I've run out of instruments. There's always one more instrument they can bring out. And periodically, when the old instrument runs out of steam, of oomph, a new instrument is trotted out, right? I mean, you just have to look at what some of our innovative colleagues across the world have been doing, and you can see instrument after instrument being unleashed. Now, I think this is sort of goes with the territory in some sense. You're sort of locked into this, but it does create a potential problem. You don't have much positive effect domestically because you are in a very low interest rate, low inflationary environment. It's not that this additional instrument, say working on long-term yields, is going to suddenly kick up investment in your country, suddenly kick up borrowing. In fact, sometimes it has perverse effects. That is, people save more when interest rates go down because they have end-of-life savings goals. You're not really having that much effect, but at least you're keeping expectations from collapsing. And therefore, when it's clear that your current instrument is not working, you move to another instrument. And so you explore the gamut of instruments. Of course, there's always the doomsday weapon, which is take a helicopter up and spray money in the streets. Even that is not clear will necessarily work, because people could essentially save the money rather than spend it. But nevertheless, that's still a policy tool you have behind your back. Now, in this kind of environment, the spillover effects could be more negative, while the domestic effects could be very small if positive. This is different from ordinary monetary policy. In ordinary monetary policy, cut interest rates, people start borrowing more and spending more, either as investment or consumption. Therefore, growth picks up in your economy, pulls in imports from the rest of the world. So even if your exchange rate depreciates, which it typically does according to the monetary theory of exchange rates, at least there's an offsetting domestic demand effect. And on net, the rest of the world may be better off when ordinary monetary policy becomes more accommodative. That's not necessarily true in an environment of very low interest rates when you follow these more and more exotic policies. And in fact, studies suggest that in an environment of ultra low interest rates, a lot of the effect can come from just the exchange rate depreciation without any significant domestic demand effects. Now, in addition to these trade effects, there's of course the effect of capital flows. That is, in this environment of very low interest rates, when you do something like putting a lid on long-term yields, what happens is money leaves the country and goes looking for further shores in which to invest. Perhaps most problematic is bank flows, which are relatively short-term, come in with a short-term horizon, leave at the first hint that interest rates are going up in the source country, and as a result, subject the emerging market to tremendous volatility. So there seems to be a problem. Now, of course, my colleagues in industrial countries sometimes say, well, aren't you complaining too much? You're complaining when the money goes in, which we complained, and you complain when the money could go out, which we also complained about. So isn't it a problem? And there's also in the background a certain sense of, Rex Harrison's line in My Fair Lady, why can't a woman be more like a man? So why can't the emerging markets be more like developed markets? Why can't you just take it, suck it up, and let the exchange rate move? And we don't complain when money comes in and goes out. Why are you complaining? And the truth is, emerging markets are not like developed markets. Our institutions are weaker, the credibility of the central bank is weaker, and therefore, what happens when, for example, we let the exchange rate adjust when money comes in, appreciate and then depreciate when money flows out, is that we risk positive and negative feedback loops. When it comes in, what happens is the exchange rate appreciates, returns are very positive, more money comes in, there is a credit boom. Not only that, sometimes, for example, in India, the budget subsidized oil prices. Oil is determined in dollars. When the rupee appreciates against the dollar, suddenly it looks like we have more budgetary room. And therefore, budgets also go spending more and more. All these things create a positive feedback loop when the exchange rate appreciates, thereby setting in place the fragilities which show up when the exchange rate depreciates. Because at that point, you find a whole lot of firms have overborrowed in dollars. You find that now, when the exchange rate depreciates, the budget is way out of clinker, and there's a possibility of very high inflation if you don't, in a sense, prevent the exchange rate from plummeting. So in this kind of environment, I could go on about other problems that emerging markets have. We simply can't let the exchange rate do all the adjustment. We would risk tremendous financial fragility if, in fact, we did that. And as a result, I think we have a problem when in fact, industrial countries follow extremely easy monetary policy. Now, this is not saying that there is no need to do that. Certainly, in industrial countries, as I said, there may be a need to preserve the sense of momentum by following these fairly aggressive monetary policies in order to keep inflationary expectations from collapsing. Nobody wants the industrial countries to collapse, but I think we have to ask the question, what's the benefit for the source country of a particular policy? What is the cost to the rest of the world of that policy? And that's where the research comes in. We don't know. We have a sense that it's hurting us in the emerging markets. We have a sense that it's helping in the industrial countries, but what are the magnitudes? And this is where we do need to take these trade-offs into account. And if, in fact, they are substantial, these effects, perhaps we need to start talking about what might be appropriate rules of the game. Now, sometimes people sort of attribute the term coordination to me, and I want to stay away from coordination. I am not in any way suggesting the chairman of the Federal Reserve will call her fellow central bankers around the world and say, can we raise interest rates tomorrow? No, that's clearly infeasible, doesn't make any sense. Coordination does take place between central banks in times of great difficulty. For example, the coordinated cut in interest rates during the crisis. But in normal times, what you want is central banks to take into account modestly the effects of their policies on other countries. And I think the best way to do that is to re-establish some rules of the game. When can you do a particular set of actions? Under what circumstances? What should you convince yourself of when you embark on that? And what should the international community believe of that at that time? So in other words, what I am suggesting is rules of the game, once again. We had one rule, no sustained unilateral intervention in the exchange rate, and maybe reintroduce that rule, but also reintroduce rules that anything which looks like that, which walks like a duck, talks like a duck, et cetera, is a duck. So no matter if you call it some version of quantitative easing or some version of monetary policy, if the primary effect is on the exchange rate or the primary effect is only on capital outflows, then it's something that we need to think about whether it's in the long run a good thing. Now, this means that most monetary policy will get a pass. Most ordinary monetary policy in normal circumstances will not be affected by these rules of the game. But it will constrain very exotic policies. Now, you may say, we're not going to have another crisis, why worry about it? But we may be in an environment of sustained low real interest rates, and the kind of actions we need to enhance inflationary expectations at this point might in fact be important. So finally, there is a question of, does this not constrain monetary policy and limit credibility? It may constrain certain kinds of monetary actions, because after all, if you have rules and they have no effect, they're not particularly useful rules. but hopefully it only constrains extreme kinds of policies. But I think this is important. I think today, one of the problems central bankers have is they're thought of as the only game in town. And therefore, all the responsibility for monetary actions falls on them. And the monetary actions, of course, but all the responsibility for policy actions falls on them. And the question is, should others bear policy responsibility? And I think again and again, when you talk to macroeconomists who know better, there is a sense of you need the whole set of tools, fiscal, monetary, and structural reforms to come together to really have a significant chance of changing the environment. One alone will not do it. We've become overly convinced that monetary policy has so many sort of powers. And in fact, I think post-financial crisis, after the initial repair of the markets that took place through QE1 or the SMP by the ECB, we are increasingly coming to the awareness that monetary policy has very little to contribute beyond that, except perhaps in stabilizing expectations. So given that, I think this Global Policy Lab, this is one of the issues which it needs to think about. How do we actually do the research and figure out what the balance of risks are, what the balance of benefits are, and what kinds of systems do we want going forward? So congratulations, Eric, for this initiative, and good luck.